Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 14. Philip's Third Marriage, 1560. The year after his return to Spain was one of the happiest in Philip's life. The violent and wilful character of his father, revere him as he might, no longer overshadowed and suppressed him. He was no longer shackled, even at a distance, to an old and ailing wife whom he could only respect. England and Cecil seemed far away. He was once more breathing the keen air of the Castilian hills, where his very being had its roots. Here there was no stench of heresy. Here there were people he understood. Spain was still Catholic and free. He had laid its enemies low. At 33 he was one of the most powerful kings in the world, and he was soon to have a young wife whose portrait by Marco Sidonio hung in his bedroom, and seemed to promise a great deal. The buoyancy and confidence he felt were reflected in his attitude towards the Cortez, which met at Toledo toward the end of 1559. Philip, with his usual fondness for play, went to the ancient capital of the Tagus on November 4th, incognito, with only 5 or 6 attendants, apparently to pick out his residence. Having decided on the Alcazar, he went off to hunt until the 20th, when he made his formal entry. When the Cortez met, he made a long and vigorous address, of which Cabrera gives the substance. He reminded the delegates that, although he was ruler also over Flanders and the estates of Italy and many others, my love and estimation prefers you to all, and I have come to remedy the evils which have commenced here, so much in offence to God and to me. Europe is now free from cares and from wars, and enjoys the general peace which I gave it by my arms, my treasures, and the glory of my victories, reducing the enemies of the crown to the knowledge of their own perversity, and my justice, power, and fortune. Consider the religious disorders in Germany and other places, through the malice of the heretics, disobedient men and persecutors of the Roman Church, in whose obedience I live, as my predecessors did, and will until death. I have asked the Sovereign Pontiff for the reassembling of the Council of Trent, the reformation of the clergy and monasteries of Spain, that they may serve God with greater integrity, purity, and perfection. As for what touches me alone, I have summoned you to see it that you live as good Christians, and good vassals of mine, for the better you are, the greater will be my excellence and glory. To this end it is necessary that, accommodating yourselves to the ways of Castile and of the time, you make laws that will reform what is evil, and will strive after what is good, with penalties to command fear. Oppress, no, for laws too rigorous destroy the Republic, as much as the crimes for whose remedies they are established. A few are enough, if they are enforced, otherwise they defeat their own purpose. Do not rush to the correction of that which, if not corrected, will cost you no loss of reputation, and do not change old laws unless they are harmful, for thus by your example your descendants will give up your new ones when they become old. Let what you do be in accord with the law of God, suitable for good example and useful for good living, in accord with the natural law. Laws must be made for subjects, just as medicines are prescribed for the particular disease and complexion of the sick. They must not be obscure, for that opens the way to wrong interpretation. My royal patrimony has been impaired by sales and forced loans, continued from the king, Don Fernando, my grandfather, through all the reign of the emperor, my lord, whose charges, obligations, and enemies I have inherited. Animated and guided by his example, I wish to fulfill the hopes his Caesarial Majesty gave the world, that I would be a good prince, when he renounced his most noble estates to me. My victories will be much better if they are not against Christians, and if my arms can be turned against the Turks and Moors who trouble these kingdoms, which they have put to so much expense by so many and such necessary wars. He concluded by asking them for money to build a fleet for the defence of his Mediterranean shores. The king's words, so grave and free, as Cabrera says, delighted the Castilians. He seemed to them to speak like a sovereign lord, revealing his greatness of soul. They thanked him and promised to serve him faithfully, but it was not until June 17, 1560, that they agreed to give him, during the next 3 years, the ordinary and extraordinary service of 1,200,000 ducats. There was more than sentiment in this, for the Turkish threat to the freedom of the West had never been more acute than at that moment. One of the consequences of the war with Pope Paul IV was the scourging of the coasts of Italy in 1558 by 100 Turkish galleys from Constantinople under the renegade Piali Pasha, the ruthless Barbary corsair Dragut Reis, and Sinan, the chivalrous Jew. They did this, Cabrera notes, to please the French and at their request, and after unspeakable atrocities in Philip's kingdoms of Sicily and Naples, overran Minorca, attacked Nice and Villafranca, and finally, worst blow of all, took Tripoli from the Knights of St. John. Malta was now the only remaining outpost in Spain's Mediterranean line of defence. Immediately after the Treaty of Catu Cambresis, Philip had promised the Grand Master of St. John his aid in the recovery of Tripoli. He was determined, though the effort required was great and plunged him still further into debt, to keep his word. With the money voted by the Cortez, he managed to have an armada of 100 sails ready for sea by the middle of November. In all there were 54 galleys and 30 ships under the command of his Viceroy of Sicily, the Duke of Medina Celi, seconded by young Juan Andrea Doria of Genoa, nephew of Philip's host of 1549. On board were 14,000 good fighting men, the majority of them Spaniards. Besides giving money for this fleet, the Cortez of October passed a few laws concerning the Moriscos. These ostensible but not always sincere Christians were so numerous in the south and east that in any conflict against Islam they were found to be objects of suspicion and sometimes a real danger to the Spanish state. The Cortes forbade them to keep Negro slaves and renewed the law of 1553, prohibiting them from carrying arms, save with a license from the Captain General. Philip explained that this law was directed only against persons under suspicion, not to all, for he knew that there were many noble persons who comported themselves as good Christians. With the Cortes over and his fleet on the seas, Philip could now settle down to the peaceful routine that he loved, the life of a constitutional monarch. For the moment, Europe was comparatively at peace. It was a good time to strengthen his ties with France and England and the Empire, meanwhile cooperating with the new Pope for the peace and security of Italy and the speedy assembly of the General Council at Trent. He wished to put an end to certain abuses that had grown up in his absence and to continue the reforms, judicial and economic, that he had begun in 1551. Finally, he was about to undertake his third venture in matrimony. The French marriage was extremely popular in Spain. The Castilians had had no queen living among them since the death of Philip's first wife 14 years before. They loved youth and beauty, both of which Elizabeth of Valois possessed. The fact that the match had been arranged to end the long feud between the two countries appealed enormously both to sentiment and to common sense. People were already calling her the Queen of Peace, Isabel de la Paz, and preparing to give her a royal welcome. There was a great flurry in Toledo when it became known that she had left Paris, where her mother was visiting the heretical Queen of Navarre. She crossed the Pyrenees with the Duke of Bourbon and other lords, spent Christmas at Pamplona, and finally reached Roncesvalles. There, on January 4th, 1560, in the valley where an imaginative person could still hear the horn of the dying Roland, echoing and re-echoing among the hallowed rocks, she was welcomed to Spain by the Cardinal of Burgos and the Duke of Infantado, who conducted her through Navarre with great splendour, followed by a long train of mules bearing her trousseau in boxes. Philip meanwhile left Toledo. With the Princess Juana, Don Carlos, and many lords and cavaliers, amid the usual abundance of music and gorgeous colour so dear to the Castilian heart, he rode west to meet her at Guadalajara. Arriving before she did, he waited for her at the sumptuous palace of the Duke of Infantado, one of the most splendid in Spain. The townspeople were almost beside themselves with joy and pride. They had even made an artificial hill at the entrance and transplanted living oaks to fashion a little park for the bride. When at last she appeared, riding a white palfrey, weary no doubt after more than a month on rough, wintry roads in all sorts of weather, they went forth to welcome her and to conduct her to the palace. Faithful to the prescriptions of Castilian court etiquette, the Princess Juana met her in the court and led her up to the great hall, where Don Felipe and Don Carlos were waiting. Philip saw, coming towards him, a very slender but fairly tall girl with black hair, dark and lovely eyes, and skin so brown that it might almost be called swarthy, decidedly a southern, Italian type, a true daughter of the Medici. She moved as lightly and gracefully as a bird. Everything about her suggested youth, joy, and goodness. There was almost always a suggestion of a tender smile on her lips. She was not over 18. When she came near Philip, she stopped and looked at him intently and searchingly. All the speeches that her mother and some of the Spanish grandees had taught her were forgotten. She could only stare at the blonde majesty before her until, if we may believe the gossipy Brantôme, the king said, "What are you looking at? To see if I have any grey hairs?" A different meeting, this, from that one at Winchester, when he had kissed Mary Tudor on the mouth by way of taking England by storm. This girl with her extremely slender waist was more to his liking. It seems probable that she had completely won his heart when they were married by the Cardinal of Burgos on February 2nd. After many feasts and many lavish entertainments by the Duke of Infantado, one of the richest of the great family of the Mendozas, the fair king and the dark queen left the palace, followed by innumerable boxes full of apparel and gifts. They were attended by a cortege brilliant enough to startle the very sun, as they now cantered, now walked their horses, over the sandy plains and snowy hills, and along the banks of the Henares, stopping only at Alcala to send the Duke back to get some rest, for his efforts to please his sovereign seemed to have exhausted him. At last they came within sight of their capital, that antique city whose shaggy crest of 100 towers and spires, zigzagging the crown of a rugged promontory, seemed always pendant in air above the wide barren countryside. El Greco has well expressed the sense of mystery that brooded over Toledo. Never was any city more fought for, more dearly bought with human blood. Long before the Incarnation, the Romans stormed it and called it Toletum. The Visigoths sacked it and ruled it for centuries. The Berbers wrested it from the Goths and rebuilt it after their own taste, imposing Moorish architecture upon the Roman and early Christian. The Crusaders of the 11th century won it from the Caliphs, to raise Gothic spires above the mosaics and Moorish arches, and to change the mosques and synagogues into churches. High on the peak of the hill, the Alcazar stood like a dark and menacing sentinel above the houses that spread below in a great fan-shaped semicircle, tier on tier, down the steep crooked streets to the ancient walls and the crooked Tagus, and the strong arches of the Roman bridge of Alcantara, where Ferdinand and Isabel had entered in triumph 3/4 of a century ago. Just as the Catholic sovereigns had seen the northern gate open and dancing boys come forth to the sound of oriental music, so now Philip and Isabel saw filing from the gate and over the bridge into the Vega 8 companies of infantry in bright colours, which shifted into squadron formation and began to skirmish. Then some cavalry appeared, half of the riders in Moorish array, half in Hungarian. To give pleasure to the Queen, they executed various manoeuvres and exchanged volleys of musketry. As the warriors filed back to the city and the Alcazar, beautiful damsels came forth to do the sword dance of the ancient Spaniards. Others did gypsy dances. Still others the dance of the 24, a la Morisca, with a tremendous accompaniment of bagpipes, flutes, and kettle drums. Now came from the Justicia 24 gentlemen in green velvet, with passamentaries of gold, and black velvet cloaks studded with jewels. These were followed by 24 ministers of the Hermandad with their green pendant. Next appeared 138 men from the Royal Mint, carrying their crimson banner embroidered with gold, together with the royal arms and the semblances of various coins. 40 others followed, dressed in scarlet, half of them wearing blue berets, surmounted by a fleur-de-lis, and bearing the azure standard of the hospital of La Piedad. And they sang, with great concerto, well-composed songs in praise of the Queen and of her most felicitous coming, and in their manner of singing imitated marvellously the birds with much fidelity. When the Queen arrived outside the Puerta de Visagra, Via Sagrada, or Via Sacra, the Holy Way at the north of the city, officials came forth in yellow suits with long gowns of azure trimmed with gold, to kiss her hand and to administer the oath that she would respect all their customs and privileges. This done, she advanced on her white hackney through the holy gate and its elaborate triumphal arch, under a canopy of brocade richly worked with her initial and her husband's, F and I, Felipe and Isabel. Viva la Reina! The crowd of townspeople, soldiers, beggars, merchants, workmen on holiday, Jews and Moors, and gypsies from Triana shouted themselves hoarse, so fresh and exquisite she seemed. The accounts of her instant popularity are unanimous, but the chief chroniclers were so interested in setting down what all the various officials and entertainers wore that they neglected the far more important duty of telling posterity anything about the new queen's costume. But where is the king? He has slipped away, apparently, to disguise himself, and is going festively about the streets of the city with 2 or 3 of his friends, including Roy Gomez, no doubt, to enjoy better, as a mere spectator, the reception his people are giving to his bride. Perhaps he is that student by the gate with his bonnet over his eyes. Perhaps he is peeping from the hood of what seems to be a Franciscan monk, a little farther along. At all events, he is somewhere in the noisy crowd, seeing the beautiful and joyful entry, the decorations of the balconies and the streets, and the many costly and various liveries, all mingling in a flowery background like a tapestry of Flanders. The Queen, attended by the Cardinal of Burgos, the Admiral of Castile, 4 dukes, including Alba, a Neapolitan prince, and sundry marquesses and counts, went slowly up the rough streets, under arch after arch made by the guilds of workmen. 2 of the most notable ones were those of the sword cutlers and the smiths, both costly and curious, with eulogistic inscriptions in Latin, Greek, and Castilian, and poetical and historical figures of good and proper significations. At the gate of forgiveness, Elizabeth dismounted. Leaning on the arm of his eminence of Burgos, she entered the holy church to give thanks to God for her happiness. The vast cathedral, one of the most beautiful in Spain, and well worth the 2.5 centuries of labour expended upon it, was illuminated with thousands of tapers. After the ceremony, the royal cortege left the church and proceeded up the hill to the Alcazar, with its 4 towers thrust into the sky like the lances of crusaders. In the plaza were statues of Hercules and other heroes, concealing fireworks, many and curious, that were set off as the Queen approached, to the huge delight of the people. And there once more were patient Lady Juana and squinting Don Carlos, with a throng of noble dames and grandees, to bid her welcome to Toledo. The crowd shouted outside, and the very hill seemed to become vocal with music, as the bride crossed the patio and passed along the Corinthian columns of the arcade to be welcomed by her husband. Feasts and balls, games, bullfights and tournaments followed day after day for weeks. Philip himself entered the lists on foot and jousted on horseback for the honour of his lady. Day and night the austere city resounded with music and laughter. One feast alone cost 100,000 ducats, or some millions of dollars in our money. Both king and people were so delighted with the Queen that the festivities might have gone on for months if royal persons had been gifted with immunity from disease. But Isabel presently became feverish, and then a rash appeared. She was immediately put to bed, where Philip, in spite of the warnings of the physicians that it might be smallpox, insisted upon attending her himself. A swift courier having carried the news across the Pyrenees, Catherine de' Medici, still lingering near the border, was gravely alarmed, fearing at first that her daughter had been smitten with the foul and incurable Italian disease, with which her grandfather, Francis I, had paid for his sins of venery, and might have handed on to his children even unto the 3rd and 4th generations. This apprehension of the Queen Mother proved unfounded. Isabel's sickness was diagnosed as a light case of smallpox, and as she was careful to follow her mother's advice about using the whites of eggs, her soft, dark skin remained unscarred. Catherine was greatly relieved, for she counted on her daughter's beauty to bring and keep Philip II within the sphere of her own political influence. War between France and England seemed imminent over the claim of Mary Stuart to the English crown. Philip's partiality to Elizabeth was well known. Of the king's feelings through all this there is no record. His wife's illness was only one of his anxieties. Before the fever left, there came a courier from the Mediterranean with news that the great fleet on which he had spent so much care and money, and which had sailed before Christmas with such high hopes of sweeping the infidel forever from the southern sea, had had one misfortune after another. There were delays, the food ran short in consequence, the men mutinied over their deferred pay and their reluctance to sail in winter. 4,000 of the troops died of sickness, leaving 10 ships unmanned. Rascally purveyors and contractors had sold bad biscuit for the voyage. Bad cooking made the matter worse, and there was continual sickness. At last, after many trials, they got to Malta on January 10th, 1560, and proceeded to Gelves. But when the great Turkish fleet suddenly appeared, poor leadership added the last touch to the record of an ill-starred voyage. The Christians, stricken with panic, suffered a terrible defeat. 65 of the ships and 5,000 men were lost. The Turks were now masters of the Mediterranean. The threat to Europe, and especially to Spain, was immediate. Philip, however, was calm and serene in misfortune. The worst of the situation was that he had no money for another fleet, nor was there time to build when the Turk was on the sea in the high tide of his fortune. It was necessary to borrow money and to hire ships. Then there was Don Carlos. Ever since his return to Spain, the king had gone to great lengths to try to win the boy's confidence, but without much success. The coming of the queen had not improved matters. There may be something in Brantome's malicious hint that Carlos was jealous of his father. That the boy worshipped Isabel, and that she, in pity, gave him an affection as tender as it was pure and motherly, seems plain enough. Carlos had once been promised this bride. Possibly he resented her marriage to his father. Philip's supposed jealousy of his son, however, may be dismissed as an improbable part of the legend created by his enemies. He was making pathetic attempts not only to win the affections of Carlos, but to gain for him the respect of the people. Few heirs of the Spanish crown were ever treated with the honour bestowed on this unfortunate boy when he received the oath of allegiance of the Cortez, the grandees, and the cities on February 22nd, 1560. Don Carlos, 15th Prince of the Asturias, was just 14 years, 7 months, and 3 days of age, according to the careful chronicler, when he went to the great cathedral on a Thursday in February, the week before Lent began, for the historic ceremony. All the wealth, grandeur, piety, and beauty of Castile were assembled there. The pontifical mass was so excellent that it couldn't be better for a pope's coronation. At the marvellous high altar, where the light comes down from above on marble angels, and the archangel Raphael, patron of joy and of happy lovers, and is diffused among columns of jasper and of bronze, were 2 archbishops and 2 bishops, in vestments of silk and gold, the precious heirlooms of saints. The Princess Juana came in a litter, wearing a black gown, with pearls and other stones in her coiffure and on her hands. Her ladies attended her, and never did the ladies go forth so richly dressed and so preciously jewelled for any solemn ceremony as for this, and glad enough to come without the French ladies, who on account of the Queen's illness with smallpox, did not shine in the solemnity. Carlos, sparkling from head to foot with diamonds and pearls, but yellow from a recent fever, came to the cathedral on a white horse, caparisons even to the cloths that trailed the ground, in gold and silver. At his left was Don Juan of Austria in crimson velvet bordered with gold and silver, graceful and splendid. Young Alessandro Farnese, Prince of Parma, rode before them. Before them went the Admiral of Castile and many other dignitaries. Some of the gold footcloths of their horses cost 2,000 ducats apiece, without computing the value of the gems with which both men and beasts were sparkling. In all this magnificence, Carlos took a childish delight. At the last, preceded by 4 kings of arms and 4 crossbowmen and mace-bearers, and the Count of Oropesa, solemnly bearing the great sword of justice on his shoulder, came the king. It was one of those occasions when Philip laid aside his customary black and appeared in pale yellow trimmed with twisted cords of brown and gold, over which, hanging from his shoulders, fell a robe of black velvet lined with marten skins and studded with diamonds. Ever since Isabel the Catholic had lifted the royal dignity from the neglect into which her weak predecessor Henry IV had allowed it to fall, with anarchy as a result, the kings of Castile had emphasized on all public occasions the importance of their office. In private, Philip dispensed with all unnecessary ceremony. In public, he insisted on the observance of all customs that hedged the throne with reverence. Cabrera cites an amusing example in connection with the present ceremony. Only the king was supposed to have his head covered on the way to the cathedral. As the weather was cold, the Count of Oropesa, having been ill, had asked permission to wear a very small cap, or a bonnetillo, and Philip had readily given his consent. But now, as the august procession approached the cathedral, he noticed that his vassal had taken advantage of his good nature to wear a very lofty headpiece covered with jewels. "Take that off," said Philip. "But your Majesty gave me permission." "Take it off." As soon as Mass was finished, the King of Arms cried, "Let those who are to take the oath to His Highness come into their places." Don Carlos sat enthroned on a platform between the king and the princes. Don Juan of Austria occupied a raised seat a little below them. Ambassadors, grandees, ricos hombres, and procuradores of cities extended in hierarchical array about them. The Count of Oropesa, with the great sword still on his shoulder, and none the worse, apparently, for the exposure of his head, now announced to Princess Juana that she must be the first to swear fealty to his highness. The judge of the Supreme Court, or Audiencia, wrote the oath from a parchment in a high voice. Joanna arose and, accompanied by the king and Don Carlos, advanced beyond the brocade draperies of the dais to a platform where Cardinal Tabera, Primate of Spain, was waiting. There she knelt, laying her hand on the Holy Gospels and on a cross. She swore to obey Prince Carlos and to hold him to be the legitimate heir of those realms. She then turned to kiss his highness's hand, but Carlos impulsively threw his arms about her and refused to let her kiss his hand. A watchful Venetian ambassador had reported that it was believed by some that the princess wished to marry Carlos, who seems very fond of her, although some years younger than she is, and on this account the prince's governors never allow him to remain alone with the princess, perhaps by the king's orders. The judge now called the most illustrious Don Juan of Austria. The handsome boy made a low reverence as he took the oath. As he advanced to take the prince's hand, Carlos snatched it away. Juan persevered, and after a slight struggle got possession of the hand and kissed it. There was a similar scene, to Philip's mortification, when the prelates advanced to take the oath. Carlos manifested an anti-clerical spirit that recalled that of his great-grandmother, Juana the Mad, and possibly gave rise to the beginning of the northern legend that he was secretly a heretic with Lutheran tendencies. He refused to give them his hand until sternly ordered to do so by his father. The grandees then took the oath. The last to kneel was the Duke of Alba, who, having sworn with his hand on the Bible and the cross, started to retire, whether through forgetfulness or by intention, without kissing the prince's hand. Carlos angrily reminded him of the omission. The Duke then hastened to make amends and to apologize, whereat Carlos effusively embraced him. Altogether it was an uncomfortable day for Philip. It was now apparent to him and to all the court that his only son would probably never be fit to rule anything, much less the greatest kingdom in Europe and the most extensive empire known to history. Philip seems to have loved the boy with a pathetic devotion and patience, and was not willing to give up hope for him until every expedient had been tried. Carlos was sane, even if eccentric. Since he was young and at a difficult age, it might be that education would develop self-respect and a sense of responsibility. Philip counted much on the influence of Don Juan, so apparently superior in every way to the legitimate heir, and on that of Alessandro, and he decided to send all three to Alcalá to pursue their Latin philosophy and other studies. In the spring, the three boys were packed off to the university town, where Carlos was given a house of his own, with grave counsellors to advise and instruct him in state matters, in the hope that some realization of his position would come to him. The Queen having recovered, the feasts now continued joyously. For several weeks the king gave himself up heartily to pleasures. All through the penitential season of the church he continued the festivities. On the first Sunday of Lent he jousted on horseback. Next day he was a challenger and a tourney in the courtyard of the Alcazar, and fought 6 cavaliers with sword and a rapier. On the following Sunday, with Don Juan of Austria and Alessandro Farnese as his aides, he fought on horseback furiously with spears, and then on foot with rapiers, for a whole hour without a moment's rest, until all were exhausted. As a result, the king had a fever and had to remain in bed 3 days. He was about again on March 13th, but had a relapse after the cane game of the following Sunday. He had recovered on March 30th, but was still weak. The king is wont to go abroad very often to amuse himself, for several days without transacting business, from which he with reason chooses to be exempt when indisposed. He kept Lord Montague and the other English ambassadors waiting 10 days to see him. They complained bitterly and suspected that his illness was feigned, and they disliked their lodgings. On April 7th, which was Palm Sunday, His Majesty, still not very strong, led a squadron in the cane game, and played his part very well and gracefully, although the Queen sent to beg him to depart a little before the end of the entertainment, together with Roy Gomez, who was not yet cured of his quartain ague. That night there was a bull bait, and the bulls were very ferocious. The king transacted business for 3 days, and then went alone to Calatrava to prepare for Easter. The The grandees were delighted when Holy Week put an end to the celebrations, for they were tired of so much expense. Philip remained away 2.5 weeks. He avoids business as much as possible, wrote Tiepolo. He returned to Toledo on April 24th, absenting himself on the 23rd, St. George's Day, to avoid having to wear the insignia of the Garter, this as a rebuke to Elizabeth and her ambassadors for the part Cecil's agents had played in the great anti-Catholic plot recently discovered in France. The king was so exasperated that he told the French envoy he would make war on the English queen unless she desisted. However imposing his majesty might appear to the public, the real government of Spain from 1559 to 1566, except for a few intervals, was in the hands of the Duke of Alba, who, for counsel, authority, and ability, wrote Tiepolo, occupies the chief place at this court. In fact, it is incredible that the king will form any fresh and important decision without the opinion of the Duke of Alba, to whose authority and knowledge he defers more than to those of anyone else. Alba was head of the dominant faction in the court, Roy Gomez of the other. Although the king depended more on Alba for advice, he loved the friend of his boyhood, as Tiepolo noticed, as much as ever, and Roy Gomez made determined efforts to displace the duke. Ranged on his side were all the rich and powerful Mendozas with their connections, including a very considerable Jewish admixture. His wife, the fascinating one-eyed Princess of Eboli, was Ana de Mendoza, daughter of the Marquess of Montejá. The Duke of Francavilla and many other nobles were on their side. When Don Bernardino de Mendoza, Admiral of the Fleet, died, they asked that he be succeeded by his son, Don Juan de Mendoza, but Alba persuaded the king to name one of his relatives, Don Garcia de Toledo. The Mendozas were furious, but Alba remained in favour. An incident occurred in July 1560 which is revealing both as to Alba and the king. When the court moved to Madrid, the Duke was known to be dissatisfied over the confidence His Majesty was beginning to repose in Secretary Arezzo, a legatee from the Emperor, noted for his judgment in financial and other matters. Alba wishes everything to depend upon himself alone, nor can he suffer others, unworthy to be compared with him, to have power equal to him and his superior in some respects. One day, when King Philip had closeted himself with Arezzo to discuss an important matter, and had told him not to open the door for anyone until they had finished, a heavy knock sounded and the door was tried. The knocking was repeated, more imperiously. Arezzo then approached and said His Majesty was there and could not be disturbed. "It is the Duke of Alba," said a voice outside. Arezzo repeated the king's orders. When Alba persisted, he opened the door to explain further. When the Duke, in a rage, less from having been denied entry than because the king was taking counsel privily from this person, whom the Duke considers his personal enemy and opposed to him, let fly in the king's hearing a volley of abuse against Arezzo, and in a violent rage asked His Majesty to give him leave to go home, as he could no longer tolerate such contemptuous treatment. The king replied that the Duke had little cause for such great anger, and the Duke rejoined that the causes of his anger were great and just, as they concerned both honour and substance, because for His Majesty's service he had sold and mortgaged many estates, and then in lieu of the reward given him by the king in Flanders, in which he had hitherto derived but little benefit, he should prefer being recompensed for those expenses, as equity and justice required, but that the king should well remember how, after the toil endured by the Duke in his service in Italy, and after security had been established there, he was deprived of that government, that he might be much more opposed and harassed at this court, where he was at length so despised that Arezzo dared to shut the door in his face, though he, the Duke, was the king's major domo, wherefore he prayed His Majesty to give him leave to go home, that he might live there with his mind more quiet and at ease. The king did all he could to appease the Duke, but at length, as the Duke insisted on having leave of absence, His Majesty said he would grant it him for a few days, but not as he required it. Alba went to his estates. "Even now," wrote Tiepolo 2 months later, "he does not say when he will return, notwithstanding the king's repeated orders for him to do so. And as a favourable demonstration, the king has sent to ask the Duke's advice about various matters. This court suffers greatly, for he exceeds all other ministers in experience and judgment." Not until the end of October, when His Majesty returned to Toledo from his field sports, was the great Duke again seen in his company. At another of Alba's absences, He said he would not return as long as Ruy Gomez was at court. A few months later, when there was talk of making new cardinals at Rome, he persuaded the king not to canvass for any Spaniard, on the ground that the Spanish cardinals at Rome were of little help, considering the large gratuities paid them. One Spanish cardinal cost as much in pensions as 5 Italians, and did less. When Don Francisco de Pacheco, a friend of Alba, received the Red Hat in 1561, the Mendoza faction alleged that Alba had deceived the king to give his own candidate a clear field. His Majesty, according to the Venetian ambassador, was displeased, but dissembles his dissatisfaction as much as possible. At the end of his first year in Spain, Philip was almost bankrupt. His war with Pope Paul IV had left him in debt to the Fuggers alone more than 3 million ducats in Spain and Flanders. He owed another 1.5 million to the fairs and huge sums to the Genoese. To meet those debts, he passed a law arbitrarily cutting the interest on his loans to 5%, in some cases from 12%. He still had possession of the estate of Silecio, amounting to 700,000 ducats. Pope Pius IV granted him the Cruzada for 3 years, equivalent to 900,000 ducats, yet his expenses were mounting rapidly. It cost millions to build the fleet of 100 vessels, with which, as he remarked to the nuncio, he intended to make the Turks repent of the trick they had played him. For the households of the king, the queen, Don Carlos, Don Juan, and the galleys of Spain and Genoa, 1.5 million of ducats per year were required. Philip was a princely giver to those he liked. Even in those days of stress, he lavished fortunes in jewels and clothing on his queen. Brantôme noticed that she never wore a dress more than once or twice, and then gave it to one of her ladies, and that the most modest of her gowns cost 300 or 400 crowns. For the king, her husband, supplies her very superbly with such things. The Cortez of 1560, at Philip's request, made her an allowance of 400,000 ducats for 3 years. For shoes. Pin money, as we should say. Her household was large and magnificent, including 4 physicians, a dwarf, clowns, and musicians. At dinner she was attended by 30 ladies, 1 as a cupbearer, 2 as carvers. Like her husband, she enjoyed jesters and buffoons after dinner, and always had music about her. She loved the theatre, and patronized Lope de Rueda, but not too handsomely, it would seem. In the fall of 1561 she paid him 200 reals for 2 comedies. When she was thrown from her carriage by the catching of her train in a wheel, the king had his master of the horse imprisoned for carelessness in arranging Her Majesty's apparel. She was only shaken up, but the doctors bled her just the same. While she was at a shrine 6 leagues from Toledo at the beginning of 1561, she was seized with what appeared to them to be a second attack of smallpox. The eruption covered her entire body, even her tongue, mouth, and throat, so that she could swallow nothing, even liquids, without the greatest difficulty. The king, on hearing of his consort's illness, went postwise to her, remaining constantly in her chamber and taking special care about her treatment and diet. But in spite of the copious bloodletting with which the physicians sought to repress the rash, as they believed they had done in the first attack, she was so pockmarked on recovering that she refused to let anyone see her for several days. Within 6 months after their marriage, Philip sent all her French servants back to France, replacing them with Spaniards, with whose service, wrote the Venetian envoy, I understand the queen and the ladies are much more satisfied, for the Frenchmen were very ill-dressed, dirty, careless, and disrespectful in their service, whereas the Spaniards make a good appearance both in apparel and cleanliness, and are so intent on their employment that they leave nothing to be wished for, and so respectful and obsequious, according to the national custom, that they seem to adore the ladies rather than to wait upon them. As the trying climate of Toledo never agreed with Isabel, her husband, early in 1561, took her to Valladolid and thence to Madrid, where he had the old Alcazar renovated and made it his capital. Certainly Madrid was more healthful than Toledo, and more healthful than it is now. Prescott apparently forgets, in his strictures on the new capital, that in Philip's time it was protected by great forests of oak and pine, which have since perished. Popular historians and biographers have portrayed Philip in the act of sticking a pin into the exact middle of the peninsula on a map and deciding to build his capital there. This agrees with the legend that there was something inhumanly cold and deliberate in the man. The story overlooks the fact that Charles V, years before, had planned to change his seat of government to Madrid. Philip was merely carrying out his father's wish. Perhaps he had promised to do so. There had been a similar controversy about the Escorial. Bractley cites the testimony of a monk who asserted that he had heard from his brother that Philip claimed to have made a vow on the day of the Battle of St. Quentin to build a monastery in honour of St. Lawrence, replacing one destroyed by his artillery. Louis Bertrand believes this. Professor Merriman gravely questions it, on the strange ground that Philip was not present at the fray, and adds that the retirement of the emperor to Yuste probably strengthened Philip's desire to build himself a residence in combination with a monastery and church, such as the emperor had asked to have provided for his sepulchre. None of them seems to have noticed that Cabrera explicitly denies the story of the vow at the battle, a story current during Philip's lifetime. No monastery was destroyed, he says, and no vow was made. However, since Philip had such success on the feast of San Lorenzo and on his octave day, he decided, out of gratitude and devotion to the great Spanish martyr, to honour him in commemorating the event. The project took more definitive form after his return to Spain. Philip himself gave a pretty complete account of his own motives in the decree he published on the subject, when the cornerstone of the building was laid in 1563. He had wanted to build some suitable monument, he said, to show his gratitude for all the blessings God had given to him and to Spain. Furthermore, the emperor, in the codicil of his will made at San Geronimo de San Yuste, had requested him to provide a suitable burial place for him and for the empress, my lady and mother, for it is a right and decent thing that their bodies be very honourably entombed, and that continuous prayers, sacrifices, commemorations and memorials be made for their souls. And since furthermore we have decided that when it shall please God to take us to himself, our bodies shall be buried in the same place, and side by side with that of the most serene Princess Donna Maria, our very dear and beloved wife, who is now in her glory, and that of the Queen Lady Isabel, who also wishes to be buried with us, when it shall please God to take her. For which considerations we found and build the monastery of San Lorenzo el Real, near the town of Escorial, in the diocese and archbishopric of Toledo, and we dedicate it and name it for the blessed St. Lawrence on account of the particular devotion which, as I have said, we ought to have to this glorious saint, and in memory of the favour and victories which we commence to receive from God on the day of his feast. As soon as he moved to Madrid, Philip began looking for a suitable site. It took him 2 years to choose, from among several possibilities, a piece of high ground about 50 kilometres from Madrid, among the Carpentano Mountains. He had plans drawn and a complete model made by his chief architect, Juan Baptista de Toledo. On April 18, 1563, the king himself broke the ground with a pickaxe, in the presence of a distinguished throng, and named the place San Lorenzo el Real de la Victoria. Workmen then began levelling off the ground, which was covered with copses and patches of rock roses, interspersed with pasture land. In a surprisingly short time, a great space was cleared, filled in, and levelled off. Stakes were driven, trenches dug for the foundations, and the first stone laid on April 23rd. The formal dedication occurred on August 20th of that year. Philip's confessor, the Franciscan Bishop of Cuenca, blessed the cornerstone and offered the work to God. Philip, as Bractley has said, was the real architect. Nothing was done, even to the smallest detail, without his approval. Whenever he could spare time from his duties at Madrid, he was likely to be found talking to the workmen, or sitting on the curious knoll called the King's Seat, for the hill naturally resembled a great chair, watching the progress of the building. He had a passion for thoroughness and accuracy in everything he did, preferring a thing well done rather than done quickly. The dilatoriness and procrastination for which he has been so much blamed were the result not so much of temperament as of principle, deliberately adopted, taken over in fact with other legacies from the emperor, who, in pursuance of his system, wrote a Venetian ambassador in 1556, chose always to be blamed for dilatoriness rather than do anything inconsiderate in haste. In fact, after he had his fling in 1560 and settled down to business, it became apparent to most careful observers that in between his maskings and revelling, he had been seriously studying the difficult art of government and was remarkably skilled in it for his years. Soriano in 1559 wrote of his unfailing courtesy, his virile presence, his acts and words full of majesty and sweetness, and noticed that he dressed quietly, but always in perfect taste. Salazar de Mendoza recalled somewhat later that he was grave, serene, and agreeable. Is this flattery? Cabrera, who does not hesitate to criticize the monarch, whom he and his father both served, calls him religious, wise, powerful but tractable, beneficent, just, ready to reward, grave, severe, constant, modest, unflatterable, inexorable against the pertinacious, without partiality, without deceit, with great zeal for the honour of God. Philip was still immature in many respects at 35, but experienced diplomats, well versed in human nature, were beginning to see that under his pliant, peaceable, and pleasure-loving exterior there was a man of solid qualities, who understood what it meant to be a king, and could work hard when he had to. It was noticed that he was more severe than formerly to all disturbers of public order, criminals, heretics, traitors, rebels, pseudo-mystics, dishonest judges, or other venal officials. His subjects, says a contemporary, would not have endured his rigour if he had not been wise and good. He seemed to them not hard but august. People feared him, but it was with a reverent fear. They knew that he loved justice above everything, and that he was consistent in enforcing his decrees. He was as severe with his own officials as he was with others, and above all, he was severe with himself. The simplicity of his personal tastes and habits, for little by little he abandoned the elaborate Flemish routine Charles had forced upon him and reverted to the old Castilian ways, endeared him to the Spanish. He had the lofty medieval conception of the duties of his office and the respect owing to it. On the other hand, he respected the constitutional rights of the people. When the Inquisition punished a preacher who had declared in the king's presence that the royal power was absolute and unlimited and could do no wrong, Philip made no protest. Never in his life did he make any such claim to despotic power as Henry VIII or as Francis I made. Yet one still reads in English and French histories of Philip's absolutism and despotism. He was always accessible to the people, at all times and in all places. Imagine him leaving the old Alcazar at Madrid, with perhaps a last approving look at the ceilings, which he had regilded to please his bride. He gets into his carriage and is driven through foul streets, as most streets then were, past some beautiful gardens and many brick houses to the cathedral. He hears Mass with great attention and reverence, and will allow no interruption until the end. Leaves the church after Mass, and is about to get into his carriage when a poor woman approaches him, weeping. Perhaps she falls on her knees and Philip raises her. Perhaps he merely says, "Calm yourself," a favourite expression with him. Sosogoas, tell me what you want. The woman tells her grievance. He asks a few brief, pungent questions, cuts short her long explanations, her flattery or her thanks, and says, "I will look into this. Thank you for telling me." He seldom, if ever, says at once, "I will grant you what you ask." He always investigates, or turns the matter over to the proper official, but he will keep his promise if possible, and will do what needs to be done. The people know this and are grateful. Perhaps a workman speaks to him on his way back to the Alcazar. Anyone, high or low, may do so, or may visit him at certain hours in his apartments. He has his breakfast. Meat forms a large part of his diet, for it is still generally believed to be better than fruit or vegetables, and Philip will pay for this later on with gout. But now he is comparatively healthy. For 2 hours he dictates letters and instructions to secretaries, giving them enough to keep them and his counsellors busy for a whole day. He reads over all his letters with care, sometimes adds a line or two in his own handwriting, and if anything is wrong or omitted, has the work done over. Each letter must be neat and attractive, as well as correct. He has a passion for cleanliness, cannot endure a spot on the floor or a streak on the wall or a cobweb in a corner. He has all the papers on his desk arranged in order and knows just where each one is. One day he steps into the next room to discuss something with Secretary Mateo Vasquez. Looking through the door, he sees an aide turning over the papers on the desk, looking for a memorandum. He controls his anger, saying in a crisp, matter-of-fact way, "Tell him I don't order his head cut off on account of the services his uncle Sebastian de Santojo has rendered me." The wretch shivers, knowing that His Majesty is capable of carrying out this threat if he gets the notion that the good of the country demanded it. Sometimes he keeps on an old secretary who has outlived his usefulness, and makes work for him. There is old Juan Vasquez, for instance. Rather than turn him loose, he has him assemble and write a history of all the royal secretaries, from the time of Almazan, secretary to Ferdinand and Isabel, to the present. A work more copious than curious, as Cabrera dryly remarks, but it keeps the old fellow alive and happy for a while. He is jealous of his royal dignity, as Oropesa and many others have learned. Of personal vanity he appears to have very little. He enters a room of the palace where Sancho Coelho is at work on a canvas. As the artist begins to arise, Philip says, "Don't get up, go on with your painting." After watching a few minutes, he steals away silently. He will laugh and joke, or seriously discuss a statue, with his sculptor, Leon Leone of Arezzo. He will talk man-to-man fashion with a workman at the Escorial. He can chat familiarly with an ambassador. On getting news of the complex situation at the conclave, he laughs and says to Tiepolo, the Venetian envoy, "What funny notions these cardinals have." All the time he is watching the Italian to see what he thinks. On public occasions or in the council chamber, he never forgot his position. He was grave, royal, pregnant of speech, sometimes terrible in his short and cold rebukes. Hearing evil spoken of others, he would turn away his face, especially if they were ministers. If anyone tried to flatter him, he would say, "Stop that, and come to the point." When anyone asked him to do an unjust thing, he would say, "I can't do that." More commonly, he would say, "That will have to be looked into," or "I will inquire into that." Many of his pungent expressions were repeated with enjoyment by the people. "One could make a good volume of his apothegms," wrote Cabrera. No matter how long-winded a visitor was, Philip listened to him patiently, if he seemed to have good intentions. It was something of an ordeal to visit him, for he took note of all that was said with admirable attention, looking the suppliant over from head to foot from the moment he entered until he left, noting his words and how he said them. Many men have testified to the overpowering effect of Philip's presence. Cabrera does not exaggerate much when he says that people who had been tried in 1,000 ordeals on the battlefield, in the council chamber, in the pulpit, soldiers, bishops, scholars, eminent preachers, were so confused when they first came into his presence that they were unable to speak. Sometimes strangers would come with elegant speeches carefully written out, but even so they were disturbed. There was, for example, a certain papal nuncio named Julian Posavino, a learned man of no common eloquence, who stammered and halted on the second sentence of a prepared oration, until the king helped him, saying with agreeable aspect, "If you have brought it in writing, I will read it, to save time." To people who were nervous or frightened, he often said gently, "Sesaguas," compose yourself. In his quest for justice, he was not always severe. He put himself to a great deal of trouble to reconcile enemies. Between unfriendly families he would arrange marriages, and between great families in different parts of the country to iron out local jealousies. Like the great Isabel, he showed a rare talent for ending feuds and factions without the use of force. He made peace between the Dukes of Medina, Sidonia, and the Dukes of Arcos, after a long enmity originating in a dispute over the curbstone of a well in Seville. He reconciled the Agramontes and the Beaumontes in Navarre, the Ones and the Gambons in Vizcaya, the Giles and the Negretes in La Montaña. If a noble were fractious, seditious, or quarrelsome, he found a way to handle him without alienating his family and all his relations. He would send him travelling on a mission, or pack him off to the wars. He ordered a troublesome official in Catalonia to come to court, and kept him there 6 years before he allowed him to return home. As a result of all this, men were beginning to say that Spain had not been so peaceful in 100 years. There were civil wars and revolts under Juan II, Henry IV, Ferdinand and Isabel, much unrest under Philip the Fair, the bloody revolution of the Comendades under Charles V. Under Philip II, there was peace. Philip won the affection of his people as well as their respect by his evident concern for their welfare, especially in times of public disaster. His relief work during fires, famines, epidemics and floods was prompt and efficient. When Valladolid burned in November 1562, he gave 50,000 ducats to rebuild it. He distributed great quantities of food and clothing, even in such remote sections as Galicia, La Mancha, and the mountains. During periods of scarcity, he employed sometimes as many as 3,000 people, men, women, and children, on the Escorial alone, not to mention other public works. One year he had them clearing away stones from the pasture lands round about. A useless thing, says Cabrera, but he did it only to keep them busy at something, and gave salaries even to the women and children. The contrast between this policy and the sweeping of thousands of the poor off the pasture lands stolen from the church in England, to starve or to take to crime as the case might be, is obvious but seldom noticed. During those first years, Philip was so popular that he went about where he pleased without a guard, like a private citizen. When he travelled, cities emptied themselves, and the highways were thronged with those who ran with admiration to see the one who governed them in peace and justice, blessing him and wishing him prosperity, long life, and all the joys he could desire. He was a king to be envied, with many joys and few troubles, when he left his wife to spend Holy Week of 1560 in prayer and meditation at the Holy Cross of Calatrava. It was good to get away from the noisy city. Madrid may have been healthier than Toledo, but it was not quiet. At break of day one could hear the Gallegos in the streets, selling water from the three fountains. At night, by the flickering light of the lanterns carried by the alguaciles of the watch on their rounds, or of the taper before a devout image or cross, one could see the street women beginning to saunter in their finery, and hear the lictor driving them away, or warning young men against the French disease. All day the sons of trade cried their wares almost to the very flagstone pavements of the palace. Flemish merchants, French hawkers, Genoese extortioners and usurers, dealers in negro slaves. On summer nights one heard the wild young Jinites riding to the Prado of St. Jerome, and those lovers that Camillo Borghese told of, laughing in the Prado. Philip had designs for ridding this city of some of its nuisances and frailties, but it would take time. As they still say in Spain of any long, interminable job, it's work on the Escorial. In summer he and his queen went to the palace at Aranjuez, which he had made over. From time to time he had built those gardens which were to make it a Spanish Versailles. It was he, after his visit to England, who first planted the elms that still adorn it. It was good to be a king, and to be still young, and in Spain.